Have you ever heard about that young woman who, in the simplicity of an ordinary life, manifested the extraordinary signs of the Passion of Christ? Saint Gemma Galgani, known as the Pearl of Lucca, lived only 25 years, but left such a profound spiritual legacy that she continues to inspire the faithful all over the world. Her life, marked by pain and joy, by the supernatural and the everyday, shows us how holiness can blossom in the most ordinary circumstances when the heart is completely given to God. Chapter 1. The Birth of a Saint. In the small village of Camigliano, near Lucca, Italy, on March 12, 1878, a little girl was born. Her parents, Enrique Galgani and Aurelia Landi, named her Gemma. As a premonition of her destiny, the name Gemma meant precious stone, and she would truly become a dazzling jewel in the church's treasure. The Galgani family was large and deeply Catholic, where faith was as natural as the morning air, and shared prayers set the rhythm of their days. From her earliest years, Gemma showed signs of an extraordinary spiritual sensitivity. Her parents marveled at how the little one, even before speaking fluently, would join her tiny hands in prayer before the sacred images adorning their home. Enrique, a pharmacist by trade, and Aurelia, a woman of deep piety, saw in these childish gestures not mere imitations, but the first glimmers of a special grace dwelling in their daughter's soul. At the age of 5, Gemma began to express with words what she had already shown through gestures, a deep love for the crucified Jesus. While other girls her age played with dolls, she would stop for long moments in front of the family room's crucifix, contemplating it with a look that revealed an understanding beyond her years. "Why is he like that?" she would ask her mother, pointing to the image of the Savior. And when Aurelia explained the mystery of redemption in simple words, the little girl's eyes would fill with compassionate tears. The Galgani home became Gemma's first school of virtues. There, she learned generosity, witnessing her father never refuse medicine to those who couldn't pay, fortitude, as she saw her mother calmly face everyday difficulties, and fraternal charity, sharing games and chores with her siblings. The seed of holiness found in this family a fertile ground to begin sprouting, nurtured by the constant example and loving guidance of those whom God had chosen as the first guardians of this precious soul. When Gemma turned 7, she was enrolled in the school run by the Sisters of St. Zita in Lucca, where the family had moved. It was there that she received her first communion, an event that would mark a turning point in her spiritual life. The preparation for this sacrament awakened in her an insatiable hunger for the Eucharistic Jesus, and the day of her encounter with the Lord under the sacred species was forever etched in her memory as the most beautiful day of my life, as she would later confess. That June 17, 1887, definitively sealed the bond of love between Christ and this little girl who, without yet knowing it, was destined to share in his sufferings in the most intimate way possible. Chapter 2. The Girl of Early Trials. Gemma's childhood, which had begun under the sign of serenity and family love, was soon overshadowed by the cross. When she was just 8 years old, the Lord allowed her to experience the first great pain of her life, her mother's illness. Aurelia, diagnosed with tuberculosis, watched her strength fade day by day as she struggled to remain the heart of the home where 7 children needed her care. Despite her tender age, Gemma became her little nurse, attending to her needs with a delicacy and devotion that amazed everyone. The long hours spent by her sick mother's bedside became for Gemma a school of patience and sacrifice. She watched closely as Aurelia, amid the most intense pains, never ceased to smile and thank God for her blessings. "Suffering is a divine gift," her mother explained, "because it makes us more like Jesus." These words, heard in the intimacy of a room where death was beginning to cast its shadow, were deeply engraved in the little girl's heart, giving meaning to the many sufferings she would later face. On September 17, 1886, the angel of death finally visited the Galgani home, Gemma, at only 8 years old, had to bid farewell to her beloved mother. The day before her passing, Aurelia gathered her children by her bedside, and with the little strength she had left, gave them her final blessing. In a whisper to Gemma, she said, "Be good, my daughter, I will be waiting for you in heaven." These words became a beacon that would guide the little one through the storms yet to come. In the days following the funeral, neighbors often found the girl kneeling by her mother's grave, not only mourning her loss, but also praying for the strength to fulfill the promise made to her mother. After Aurelia's death, Gemma's paternal aunt, Elena, moved into the family home to help care for the children. She was a pious woman with a stern character whose approach to discipline might be considered excessively rigorous by today's standards. Under her care, Gemma learned to master her emotions and to practice obedience even in the smallest details. Although those years were hard for the sensitive girl, she would later recognize that such discipline was providential in shaping a spirit of mortification and self-denial, virtues that would be essential on her path to holiness. The trials continued when Gemma was 11, with the severe illness of her brother Gino, who was preparing for the priesthood. For months, the girl divided her time between school, household tasks, and caring for her dear brother. When Gino finally passed away, Gemma understood that God was preparing her for something special through these losses. "Jesus takes away those I love one by one," she wrote in her diary, "but not to leave me alone, but so that only He may fill my heart." Odin, this insight, born of pain yet illuminated by faith, reveals the spiritual maturity already present in one who was still just a child in the eyes of the world. Before continuing, we know that many who have read this are devotees of Saint Gemma, while others are now getting to know her for the first time. Please share in the comments your experiences and prayer requests so that our community may always be strengthened in faith. United in prayer, we are stronger. Let us continue. Chapter 3. The Blossoming of Faith. The years of adolescence brought a time of inner deepening and growing intimacy with God for Gemma. At 15, while her schoolmates began dreaming of dances and suitors, she felt an increasingly intense inner call toward a life of consecration. The sisters of Saint Zita, who had been her teachers during childhood, watched with admiration as the young woman with luminous eyes and a gentle character spent long periods in the school chapel, absorbed in prayer. "It seems she sees what we cannot see," one of the nuns commented, observing her as she contemplated the tabernacle with an expression that reflected an invisible yet real dialogue. It was during these years that Gemma began to experience the first extraordinary mystical graces. On occasion, during Mass or moments of private prayer, she felt such a vivid presence of Christ that she lost track of time and space. These experiences left her with a burning desire to completely surrender to the one who attracted her with bonds of love. Yet far from taking pride in these gifts, Gemma carefully concealed them, aware that they were not her own merit, but pure divine grace. Her spiritual director at the time, Father Volpi, who was privy to her inner experiences, guided her with prudence, advising her to remain humble and not to give undue importance to these extraordinary manifestations. The death of her father, which occurred when Gemma was 18, dealt another devastating blow to the young woman. Enrique Galgani, who had mismanaged the family's financial affairs, left his children in a state of great precariousness. Overnight, Gemma went from living in a comfortable home to experiencing severe poverty. The siblings had to scatter, taken in by various relatives, and she found refuge in the home of the Giannini family, known in Lucca for their generosity toward those in need. This trial, far from weakening her faith, only strengthened it. "Now I am truly poor like Jesus," she wrote in a letter to her sister. "What better way to be like him?" Life in the Giannini household marked the beginning of a new stage on Gemma's spiritual path. Mrs. Cecilia, the lady of the house, a woman of deep piety and mother of 11, soon recognized the extraordinary virtue of the orphaned young woman under her roof. She gave Gemma a small room where she could retreat to pray and allowed her to attend Mass daily, despite the distance from the nearest church. It was during this time that Gemma began writing her spiritual diary, as advised by her confessor, a document that would later become a treasure of mystical literature and a living testimony of her journey toward union with God. At 20, Gemma expressed her desire to enter religious life. Her heart leaned toward the Passionist Sisters, a congregation founded by St. Paul of the Cross, whose charism of contemplation and adoration of the crucified Christ resonated deeply with her own spirituality. However, her fragile health and the lack of a dowry, a common economic requirement at the time, presented insurmountable obstacles. Faced with these difficulties, Gemma was not disheartened. "If I cannot be a religious in a convent," she confided to her spiritual director, "I will be a religious in the world." This decision, made in the simplicity of a surrendered heart, would mark the definitive course of her brief but intense journey toward holiness, making her a forerunner of what the Church would later recognize as the vocation of consecrated laity. Chapter 4. The Messenger of Heaven. In the spring of 1898, as Gemma entered a period of special intensity in her spiritual life, she began to experience a new and comforting presence at her side. It was not a mere intuition or a vague sense of protection, but a true companion on her journey, one invisible to the physical eye, but clearly perceptible to the soul. It was her guardian angel, who manifested with a surprising closeness and familiarity. "I am never alone," Gemma would write in her diary. "Even when everyone abandons me, he faithfully remains by my side." Gemma's relationship with her guardian angel soon acquired extraordinary characteristics. It was not just that she felt his protective presence, as many faithful do, but that she maintained genuine dialogues with him. The angel appeared to her in human form, like a young man of great beauty and luminous gaze, and spoke in an audible voice, instructing her in the mysteries of the faith and advising her on her doubts. The members of the Giannini household observed, astonished, how Gemma sometimes appeared to converse with an invisible interlocutor. When asked with whom she was speaking, she would simply reply, "With my angel," giving little importance to what had become natural to her. One of the most important services the angel provided was as a messenger. Often, Gemma entrusted him with letters destined for her spiritual director, Father German, a Passionist priest living far from Lucca. And the angel, according to both their testimonies, faithfully delivered these messages. Even more astonishing, on occasions when Gemma lacked paper or ink, she would dictate her communications mentally to the angel, who transmitted them with perfect accuracy to the priest. Initially skeptical, Father Germain eventually confirmed the authenticity of these phenomena upon receiving information that only Gemma could have known, communicated through this supernatural medium. Her guardian angel was also a teacher of virtues. With particular insistence, he taught her the value of purity, a virtue she guarded as a precious treasure. "Remember," her celestial instructor would say, "that a pure soul can do all things before God." And whenever some moral danger approached, the angel would promptly warn her. Witnesses recall one occasion when, while Gemma was walking in the streets of Lucca, she suddenly changed direction without apparent reason. Later, she would confess that her angel had advised her to avoid a certain encounter that might have tempted her innocent soul. Gemma's devotion to her guardian angel was not limited to extraordinary experiences. It also manifested in the simple practices recommended by the Church to all the faithful. Every morning, she greeted him with a prayer. Every night, she thanked him for his company throughout the day. She consulted him on important decisions and sought his help with daily tasks. "My good angel," she would often say, You who continually see the face of my Jesus, speak to him on my behalf and tell him how much I long to love him. This filial trust in her celestial protector would become one of the most characteristic features of Saint Gemma's spirituality, later inspiring many faithful to rediscover the importance of this devotion as old as the Church itself. Chapter 5. Dialogues with Heaven. The year 1899 marked a turning point in Gemma's spiritual life. During a severe illness that confined her to bed for months, with intense pain and persistent fever, she began to experience visions of Jesus, the Virgin Mary, and various saints. These supernatural manifestations, far from being vague or confused, appeared with astonishing clarity. Gemma saw her heavenly visitors with her physical eyes, heard their voices with her ears, and sometimes even felt the touch of their hands as they consoled her amid her suffering. "They are not dreams or imaginations," she insisted when her confessor wisely tried to attribute these phenomena to fever or delirium. "I see them as clearly as I see you now." Among all her celestial interlocutors, Jesus held the most privileged place. Her conversations with the Lord were characterized by a simplicity and familiarity reminiscent of those of the greatest saints of the Catholic tradition. Gemma spoke with Christ as a child speaks with her father or as a wife with her beloved husband, alternating intimate confidences with petitions for the needs of the Church and souls. "Jesus, why do you love me so much if I'm so miserable?" she frequently asked. And the answer she received in her heart was always the same: "I love you precisely because you recognize your misery. It is in the small and humble that I find delight." The Most Holy Virgin, whom Gemma affectionately addressed as Mommy, also appeared in these mystical experiences. Mary generally appeared clothed in an indescribable sweetness, yet without concealing the demands of the path of holiness. "My daughter," the Mother of God said on one occasion, "the cross is the most precious treasure that my Son can bestow upon you. Embrace it with love, for in it you will find true life." Ooh, these words, far from frightening Gemma, ignited in her an ever-burning desire to conform to the crucified Christ, to the point of pleading, "Lord, if you do not deem me worthy of your wounds, at least allow me to share in your sufferings." Saint Gabriel of Sorrows, a Passionist canonized shortly before, became another frequent celestial visitor to Gemma. This young saint, who had died at the age of 24 and was known for his intense devotion to Our Lady of Sorrows, appeared as an elder brother guiding her along the path of perfection. It was he who suggested that she write to the Passionist fathers to request admission into the corresponding female order, and he consoled her when the convent doors closed before her due to health or financial reasons. "Do not worry," St. Gabriel assured. "You will be a Passionist in spirit, even if you cannot be so in habit." Although these mystical experiences were extraordinary, they did not detach Gemma from everyday realities, nor exempt her from the duties inherent to her state. On the contrary, they strengthened her to face daily challenges with renewed vigor and to serve those around her with even greater dedication. The Giannini family, privileged witnesses to her life, noted how after these heavenly encounters, Gemma became more diligent in her household tasks, more patient with the children, and more attentive to everyone's needs. This was the clearest evidence of the authenticity of her experiences, for as the Gospel teaches, you will know them by their fruits. And the fruits of Gemma's mystical life were, without doubt, the constant growth in Christian virtues and an ever-burning love for God and neighbor. Chapter 6. The Passionist at Heart. From her earliest years, Gemma felt an irresistible attraction to consecrated life. This calling was realized when she met the Passionist Fathers during a mission in Lucca. The charism of this congregation, founded by St. Paul of the Cross and centered on the loving contemplation of the Passion of the Lord, resonated deeply within her soul. Upon hearing them speak of the sufferings of Christ, she would later confess, "I felt my heart burn with an unknown fire. I then understood that God was calling me to follow that path. A day with the determination characteristic of her spirit, Gemma did not hesitate to apply for admission to the convent of the Passionist Sisters in Tarquinia, the nearest one to Lucca. She carefully prepared her request, supported by recommendations from priests who knew of her virtuous life. Her hopes were high, for she felt deep within that this was her place. However, the response was a painful rejection. The reasons were mainly two: her fragile health, marked by frequent illnesses, and the lack of a dowry, an economic requirement common at the time for entering religious life. "I do not understand, Jesus," she wrote in her diary after receiving the news. "Why do you deny me what seems to be your own will?" The answer to this anguished question came through Father Germain, who had become her spiritual director. "My daughter," the wise priest explained, "God does not want you to be a passionist by habit, but by spirit. Your mission is to be crucified in the world." These words illuminated Gemma's path. She understood that her vocation was to live the passionist spirituality amidst ordinary realities, transforming the Giannini household, where she resided, into her own monastery. Thus she accepted God's will with peace and prepared to live her consecration in a manner then uncommon, but which would later prefigure what the Church would recognize as the vocation of consecrated laity. Chapter 7. The Stigmatized of Lucca. On the afternoon of Thursday, June 8, 1899, on the eve of the Feast of the Sacred Heart, while Gemma was praying intensely in her room, she experienced a vision that would definitively change the course of her life. The Virgin Mary appeared to her, accompanied by her guardian angel, and announced, "Daughter, today you will receive a great gift from my Son." Shortly after, Jesus himself appeared before her, with his 5 resplendent wounds, from which no blood flowed, but flames of fire. These flames reached Gemma's hands, feet, and side, causing her acute pain while filling her with an indescribable joy. When the vision ended, the young woman discovered in amazement that the marks of the Passion had been imprinted on her body. She had received the stigmata. The phenomenon of the stigmata repeated every week, from Thursday afternoon until Saturday morning, coinciding with the hours of the Lord's Passion. The wounds would open with precise timing, bleed abundantly, and then close without leaving any scar. This extraordinary event soon attracted the attention of those living with Gemma in the Giannini household. Mrs. Cecilia, the lady of the house and a privileged witness to these events, described in detail what she observed. The wounds were real and deep, perfectly circular on the hands and elongated on the feet, as if made by nails. The wound on the side, located at the heart's level, was crescent-shaped and bled a mixture of blood and water, especially on Fridays. Reactions to these phenomena were varied. Some, impressed by Gemma's evident sanctity, saw in the stigmata a confirmation of her heroic virtues. Others, more skeptical, suggested natural explanations: self-suggestion, hysteria, or even simulation. The ecclesiastical authorities, following their customary caution regarding supernatural manifestations, ordered rigorous medical examinations. Several doctors examined the wounds, took samples of the blood that flowed from them, and subjected Gemma to thorough interrogations. None could offer a satisfactory scientific explanation. One of them, Dr. Fanner, initially skeptical, concluded his report with these words: "Medical science cannot explain what I have seen in this young woman. If this is not a miracle, I do not know what to call it." For Gemma, the stigmata were not a source of pride, but of deep humility. Rather than displaying them, she did everything possible to conceal them, wearing gloves when the wounds were visible and retiring to her room during the most intense episodes. "I do not deserve these signs," she confided to her spiritual director. "So many saints have loved Jesus more than I have and have not received them. Ask him to take them away from me and grant me more love in return." This attitude of humility was the best assurance of the authenticity of her experience, for as the Church's spiritual tradition teaches, true mystics never seek extraordinary phenomena, but union with God in simplicity and concealment. The profound meaning of Gemma's stigmata went beyond the physical phenomenon itself. Through them, the Lord invited her to a more intimate participation in the mystery of redemption. It was not merely an external manifestation, but a visible sign of her inner conformity with the crucified Christ. Gemma understood this clearly and expressed it in a letter to Father Germain. Jesus has wished to imprint his wounds on me, not so much on my unworthy body, but on my heart. It is there that I truly feel the passion, and it is there that I wish to accompany my spouse to Calvary. This understanding of the meaning of her suffering elevated her above physical pain and placed her within the pure current of Christian mysticism, a mysticism that sees in identification with the suffering Christ not an end in itself, but the necessary path to the fullness of resurrected life. Chapter 8. Redemptive Suffering. Gemma's fragile body, already marked by the stigmata, would soon endure other forms of physical suffering. In early 1901, she began to experience the first symptoms of bone tuberculosis that would progressively attack her spine. The pains were intense, but the young woman bore them with a serenity that astonished those who cared for her. When the Giannini family's doctor explained the gravity of her condition, Gemma responded with a smile. "Doctor, do not worry about me. This disease is a gift from heaven, for it allows me to unite more closely with the cross of my Jesus." For her, the illness was not a divine punishment nor a random misfortune, but a precious opportunity to complete in her flesh what is missing from the passion of Christ, as expressed by St. Paul. The last months of her life were a true Calvary. The tuberculosis advanced inexorably, causing not only bone pain, but also extremely high fevers and a persistent cough that prevented her from resting. To these afflictions were added equally painful spiritual trials, periods of dryness in prayer, temptations against her faith and hope, and a feeling of abandonment by God. It was the dark night that so many mystics experience as the final purification before the definitive encounter with the Beloved. Yet even in this inner desert, Gemma maintained peace. "If Jesus hides," she confided to her confessor, "it is to test my love. And I want to love him just the same, whether he is present or absent, consoling or silent." One of the most admirable aspects of Gemma's suffering was the spiritual fruitfulness she was able to give it. Rather than selfishly focusing on her own pain, she constantly offered it for specific intentions: the conversion of sinners, the liberation of souls from purgatory, the sanctification of priests, the needs of the Pope, and that of the universal Church. Her prayers were remarkably effective, as testified by several priests who entrusted her with difficult cases. Father Germain would recount with amazement how hardened sinners, for whom Gemma had offered her sufferings, unexpectedly approached the sacrament of confession, sometimes after decades of being estranged from God. "It is as if her sufferings had a special power to soften even the hardest of hearts," commented the experienced missionary. Gemma's charity also manifested in her care for the sick. Despite her own precarious condition, she found strength to visit the neighborhood's ill, bringing not only spiritual comfort, but also small material tokens arranged by the generous Giannini family. When she could no longer leave her home, she asked for news of the sick and sent messages of encouragement. A neighbor in Lucca testified that when her son was gravely ill and given up on by doctors, Gemma visited her and assured her of the boy's recovery. "Do not cry anymore," she said firmly. "Your son will not die now. I asked Jesus, and he granted it, but in exchange, I must suffer more." The following day, the boy experienced an inexplicable improvement, while Gemma's condition deteriorated significantly. The doctors attending her could not understand how this young woman could bear so much pain without complaint. One of them, Dr. Fanner, even declared that by all medical principles, Gemma should have been unconscious or at least demanding potent analgesics. Yet instead, he found her serene, sometimes even smiling. "There is something supernatural about this patient," he finally admitted. "Her fortitude cannot be explained by mere psychological resistance to pain." Gemma had understood and intensely lived the Christian paradox of redemptive suffering, that pain, when united with Christ's, mysteriously becomes a source of life and salvation for many. "If you only knew Jesus," she prayed in her final days, "how sweet it is to suffer for you. I desire nothing more than your cross, for in it I find you, my only love." Chapter 9. The Battle Against Evil. Alongside her struggle against disease and physical pain, Gemma waged another equally demanding battle, the spiritual fight against the forces of evil. Starting in 1899, coinciding with the onset of the stigmata, she began to experience extraordinary manifestations of diabolical harassment. The demon, enraged by the sanctity of this young woman who was drawing so many souls away from his dominion, unleashed a veritable war against her. The forms of these attacks varied, from violent inner temptations against faith and purity to external manifestations, such as terrifying noises, monstrous apparitions, and, most painfully for Gemma, physical assaults that left her covered in bruises. Witnesses to these phenomena were left stunned. Mrs. Cecilia Giannini recounted how on several occasions she found Gemma thrown to the floor of her room, battered and exhausted after an invisible struggle. Monsignor Volpi, auxiliary bishop of Lucca, who was sometimes skeptical about the young woman's mystical experiences, had to concede when he personally witnessed some of these episodes. On one occasion, while conversing with Gemma in the Giannini living room, he saw a heavy inkwell shoot off the table without anyone touching it, heading straight toward her. The prelate was so impressed that he began showing greater understanding toward the extraordinary phenomena surrounding that privileged soul. In the face of these attacks, Gemma employed the traditional weapons recommended by the Church: constant prayer, especially the Holy Rosary, the use of holy water, which she generously sprinkled around her room, confident invocation of Saint Michael the Archangel and her guardian angel, and above all, frequent reception of the sacraments of confession and the Eucharist. Yet her most effective weapon was humility. "Nothing does the devil fear more," she wrote in her diary, "than a soul that recognizes itself as small and helpless and puts all its trust in Jesus." This attitude of spiritual smallness, inspired by the evangelical childhood, baffled the enemy, whose fundamental sin is precisely pride. Father Germain, an expert in spiritual direction and a deep connoisseur of Catholic hagiography, recognized in Gemma's experiences a pattern observable in the lives of many great saints. "Do not be afraid," he advised in his letters. "If the devil torments you so much, it is a sign that God loves you in a special way and has destined you for a high spiritual mission. The enemy does not bother to attack mediocre souls." And he reminded her of the examples of Saint Anthony the Abbot, tormented by demons in the desert, of Saint Teresa of Avila, who experienced similar persecutions, and above all of Saint Paul of the Cross, founder of the Passionists, who suffered diabolical assaults akin to hers for decades. But beyond the external attacks, Gemma waged another, more subtle yet equally decisive battle: the fight against ordinary temptations and the imperfections of human nature wounded by sin. Like everyone else, she experienced moments of impatience, flashes of vanity, and disordered attachments to people or earthly goods. The difference was in how quickly she recognized these tendencies and the energy with which she combated them. Her daily examination of conscience was meticulous, her sorrow for even the slightest fault sincere and profound, and her determination not to repeat them was firm. "I want Jesus to find in me a pure heart," she asserted with conviction, and to achieve this, She did not hesitate to impose small mortifications on herself, forgoing a legitimate pleasure, holding back a word of self-defense, or performing an unrequested act of service for someone unpleasant. In these seemingly insignificant daily victories, Gemma built the edifice of her holiness, convinced that faithfulness in the small prepares one for great faithfulness, as her spiritual director had taught her. Chapter 10. Humility and Obedience. Among the virtues that adorned Gemma's soul, two shone with particular brilliance: humility and obedience. These two virtues, often undervalued in modern society, were for her fundamental pillars of authentic Christian life, following the timeless teaching of the Church and the example of Christ, meek and humble of heart, who became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. Gemma's humility was not a matter of self-deprecating words or external gestures of abjection, but of genuine self-awareness in the light of God. She saw herself as she truly was, a limited creature, a forgiven sinner, an imperfect instrument in divine hands. This realistic perspective freed her from two equally dangerous extremes: despair over her faults and presumption over her gifts. When someone praised her piety or virtues, she would simply reply, "I do not know myself very well, but I believe that if others saw what God sees in me, they would not esteem me so highly." And when someone, on the contrary, criticized or belittled her, she accepted the judgment with serenity, thinking that perhaps the person was more benevolent than she deserved. This humility was particularly evident in her attitude toward the extraordinary mystical gifts she received. Far from boasting about them or considering them her own merit, she saw them as pure divine grace that imposed upon her a greater responsibility and self-offering. On several occasions, she asked the Lord to remove the external manifestations of the stigmata, not so much because of the physical pain they caused, but because of the attention they attracted. "I wish to love you in secret, hidden from the eyes of the world," she confessed in her diary. And when she was forced to speak of her supernatural experiences, she did so with such naturalness and detachment that it was evident she did not place greater importance on them than on the ordinary graces received by any Christian in the sacramental life. Obedience, a necessary complement to humility, shone in Gemma with equal intensity. For her, the will of her legitimate superiors, her spiritual director, her confessor, the priests who guided her, was an expression of the divine will. Even when the instructions received contradicted her natural inclinations or inner impulses, Gemma obeyed promptly and joyfully. A touching example was her attitude toward the tests imposed on her by various theologians and ecclesiastical authorities to discern the authenticity of her mystical experiences. Some of these examinations were particularly harsh: long hours of interrogations, temporary prohibition from receiving daily Eucharist, her greatest comfort, and orders to interrupt certain devotions dear to her. In the face of all these trials, Gemma displayed perfect obedience, without complaints or murmurs. The only limit Gemma placed on her obedience was sin, following St. Peter's maxim, "It is necessary to obey God rather than men." Otherwise, her submission was complete, encompassing not only the external compliance with what was commanded, but also the inner adherence, avoiding that subtle disobedience of obeying with the body while the heart rebels. This docility was not the result of a weak character. Gemma possessed a defined personality and a resolute temperament, but of a conscious choice based on two deep convictions: that obedience is the surest way to know God's will, and that it is the virtue that most swiftly destroys selfishness, the root of all sin. The combination of humility and obedience produced in Gemma a surprising inner freedom. Paradoxically, the more she submitted to spiritual direction and the norms of Christian life, the more she experienced that freedom of spirit which is the heritage of the saints. She did not live these virtues as external impositions or restrictions to her personality, but as wings that lifted her toward God, the center of all her desires. "Virtue is not a cage that imprisons me," she wrote in one of her last letters, "but a path that leads me to true freedom, the freedom of the children of God." This understanding of virtuous life as liberating rather than constrictive, emanating from her intimate experience of divine love, is perhaps the deepest lesson that Saint Gemma offers to contemporary man, so zealous for autonomy, yet so often enslaved by his passions. Chapter 11. The Final Flight. By the spring of 1903, Gemma's health deteriorated rapidly. Tuberculosis had invaded not only her bones, but also her lungs, causing severe respiratory crises that left her exhausted. The doctors, unable to halt the disease's advance, could only offer palliative care for her pain. At those moments, the Giannini family multiplied their attentions, watching over her day and night with a moving dedication. Grateful for all this care, Gemma tried not to be an excessive burden, and even amid her suffering, she maintained a serene smile that amazed everyone. "Do not worry so much about me," she would say sweetly. "Soon I will no longer trouble you, and I will be with Jesus." In the first days of Holy Week that year, Gemma understood that her moment of departure was near. With remarkable lucidity, she predicted the exact day of her death, Holy Saturday, April 11th. "It is the most appropriate day for me," she confided to Mrs. Cecilia. "While everyone is busy preparing the Easter celebration, I will quietly leave for heaven." This certainty did not come from medical calculations, but from an inner revelation granted to her during prayer. Her final weeks were an impressive testament to faith and surrender into divine hands. Despite the intense pain, she refused medications that might cloud her mind, wishing to remain lucid until the end, so that every moment of suffering could be offered in union with the passion of Christ. In her last days, Gemma experienced a gradual detachment from all earthly things. She requested that all her belongings be removed from her room, except for a crucifix and an image of the Virgin Mary. Her conversations revolved almost exclusively around spiritual matters, especially divine mercy and eternal life. She fervently received the sacraments, with the Eucharist as her main support and comfort. Those who visited her were struck by the peace emanating from the dying young woman, so different from the restlessness that usually accompanies terminal patients. Father Germain, who went to Lucca to accompany her in her final moments, later declared, "I did not witness an agony but a passing." Gemma did not die. She was transformed. On the morning of Holy Saturday, just as she had predicted, Gemma's condition worsened significantly. The fever rose, her breathing became more difficult, and an extreme paleness overtook her face. Around her bedside gathered members of the Giannini family, several priests who had spiritually accompanied her, and a few close friends. Fully conscious until the end, Gemma requested that they read to her the Passion, according to St. John, and renewed her profession of faith. Around 3 in the afternoon, the hour when Christ died on the cross, she entered a state of ecstasy. Her eyes, fixed on a point invisible to others, shone with an indescribable expression of joy. Her lips murmured, "Jesus, I love you, Jesus." And with those words of love, she entrusted her soul to the Creator, completing exactly 25 years, 1 month, and 26 days of age. News of her death spread quickly throughout Lucca. Although Gemma had lived discreetly, her reputation for sanctity had transcended the Giannini family circle. A multitude came to see for the last time the one they called the Little Saint. The flowers that covered her deathbed disappeared within minutes, taken by the faithful as relics. The priests who had witnessed her passing testified that Gemma's body emitted a soft fragrance of violets, a phenomenon that Catholic tradition associates with sanctity and is known as the odor of sanctity. Even more surprising, the wounds of her stigmata, which during her life would vanish a few hours after appearing, remained visible on her lifeless body as a final testimony to the supernatural character of the phenomenon. Chapter 12. Prayer to Saint Gemma. O glorious Saint Gemma Galgani, you who knew pain and transformed it into love, look with compassion upon our needs and present them before the throne of the crucified Christ, whom you loved so dearly. Help us imitate your purity of heart, your profound humility, and your perfect obedience. Teach us to converse intimately with our guardian angel as you did. Strengthen us in times of trial so that, following your example, we may embrace our daily crosses and transform each suffering into a loving offering to the Lord. And when our final hour comes, grant us your presence so that, like you, we may depart this world with the names of Jesus and Mary on our lips and their love burning in our hearts. Amen.